if you have your Bible, if you would turn with me to Leviticus chapter 25. And we have 2 weeks remaining in Leviticus. So I'm sorry to inform you that our time in this book will be coming to a close soon. If you've been in a small group and you've studied Leviticus, you know that we're already through it there too. And so we will be moving on from Leviticus. But as hopefully you've been seeing in the daily worship guide, you never move on from Leviticus. Because at every turn and point in the New Testament, it is clear that the authors of these texts have Leviticus deep in their souls. So we're going to get started by just jumping right into our reading. So chapter 25, verse 1. The Lord spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai, saying, "Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land that I give you, the land shall keep a Sabbath to the Lord. For 6 years you shall sow your field, and for 6 years you shall prune your vineyard and gather in its fruit. But in the 7th year there shall be a Sabbath of solemn rest for the land, a Sabbath to the Lord. You shall not sow your field or prune your vineyard." Before we keep reading, I want to make a quick claim about what's happening here in Leviticus. Practically speaking, what is described in what we just read is a complete ceasing of any kind of work on the land for a year. No sowing or planting or reaping. It is a Sabbath rest for the Lord. But there's something else going on here. Leviticus, as an entire book, opens with God inviting his people to draw near to him, to meet with him. And we learn along the way that this holy God desires to meet with his holy people so that he can make them holy, as he is holy. And so in this way, the book of Leviticus is about the ways in which this holy God attempts to make a holy people. And so as the book unfolds, we're given descriptions of holy worship, a holy diet, holy boundaries, holy neighborly relations, holy sexuality, holy priests, and holy days. And we come to these final chapters of Leviticus where now we're given descriptions of a holy use of the land over periods of time marked by holy years. The lives of God's people are now almost totally defined by God's instructions. But Leviticus has just begun to say what it wants to say about a holy land and holy time. And so let's keep reading. And we're going to jump a bit because we're going to make our way through both chapters 25 and 26. And so in order to kind of get an overall sense of what's happening, we'll skip some parts. And I'll expect you to go back and read all of the little details in there. Maybe. Okay, verse 8. You shall count 7 weeks of years, 7 times 7 years, so that the time of the 7 weeks of years shall give you 49 years. Then you shall sound the loud shofar in the 10th day of the 7th month. On the day of atonement, you shall sound the shofar throughout all your land. And you shall consecrate, set apart the 50th year, and proclaim liberty through the land to all of its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you, when each of you shall return to his property, and each of you shall return to his clan. So, the 50th year is called a jubilee. In verse 12, we're told that it shall be holy for you. Recall, earlier in Leviticus, the Day of Atonement. This was the single holy day each year when the high priest would sacrifice on behalf of all of Israel, and he would go into the most high place and he would make atonement so that all of the people would be cleansed from their sin, and so that the tabernacle and all of its vessels and all of its priests would be atoned for. A yearly wiping clear of the slate, a mulligan, a fresh start. On this day, the 50th year, a shofar or a ram's horn would be blown throughout the land, signaling liberty for all. We're not really given much detail here yet, but liberty sounds awesome, right? We'll get some explanation of that. And also, while the people are to return to their property and to their clans, we're not quite yet sure what this is going to look like or what this means. And so jump down to verse 18, where we'll keep reading. Therefore, you shall do my statutes and keep my rules and perform them. And then you will dwell in the land securely. The land will yield its fruit, and you will eat your fill and dwell in it securely. Real quick, it's good to notice if-then statements like this. But let's keep reading in verse 23, where we get some foundational details about what is going on here. We hear, the land shall not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine. For you are strangers and sojourners with me. And in all the country you possess, you shall allow a redemption of the land. Here is the central idea, or a central idea, to all of God's dealings with Israel throughout all of the First Testament. The land is not theirs. It does not belong to them. The land belongs to God. Israel has zero right to the land. Zero. The land is a gift. It is not something they deserve. And as we just read in verse 18, it is a gift that is directly tied to Israel's desire to obey God's voice, to keep his covenant, and to be God's treasured possession in the world. This has two very practical implications for the Israelites. First, they cannot sell the land. They cannot sell the land to someone permanently because it does not belong to them. Therefore, any sale of the land that happens always happens with the knowledge that the land is going to be returned at the next Jubilee. And second, if they are not the landowners, that makes them tenants. In the ESV, they are called strangers and sojourners. And a number of scholars believe that these two words together are kind of a stock phrase with one meaning something like resident alien. They are resident aliens in the land. And 2 weeks ago, we were in Leviticus 19, and we read this. You must treat the resident alien as though he were a native among you. And they were told this then in Leviticus 19 because the rationale given is that they had just come from a situation where they were resident aliens in Egypt. But now they're given a new rationale. Here we learn it's because the Israelites actually are no different in status from the non-Israelites among them. Both are resident aliens, human beings living by God's generous provision. Grace, recipients of grace. And I think that there is something here for the church in America. Christians are among the most eager in our country to demand our rights. We have the right to say what we want, to carry our guns, to own our property, to do what we want with our property. We have the right to privacy. We have the right to life. I think that a good starting place for something called revival in the church would be for Christians empowered by the Spirit to begin releasing whatever delusions we have about our own rights or what we think we might deserve. Let me say it this way. The entire framework of this 50-year event called Jubilee required that the people of Israel understand themselves in this particular way. We are resident aliens, recipients of a gift. Jubilee required God's people define themselves as God defined them, or else it could never work. Listen, when you hear someone say that one of Jesus' commands are impossible or that they dismiss them as impractical, there's often a simple reason they come to this conclusion. They define themselves in a way differently than God does. Right? I am an American, and therefore I deserve. I'm a business owner. I have earned. Fill in the blank. Whatever it is, that place of identity is often counter to the way that God understands who he has made us to be. And here we are in the Holy of Holies of Leviticus. The Israelites' self-definition is being challenged. And so is ours if we will have ears to hear. Leviticus 25 confronts us with the truth about God, the truth about ourselves, that all that we have is grace and gift. And the same was true for Israel. And Israel squandered that gift. Israel refused to live as though all that they had was truly a gift. And so finally, Israel forfeited that gift. And thus, the necessity of redemption. When we talk about God as Redeemer, we are identifying God as the great buyer, purchasing back all that has been lost or stolen or taken from him. His people, their land, humanity, and the whole earth. Here the land, that which God has purchased for his people, they have lost and is now in need of being repurchased again. As we begin to read again, what we're going to find in the rest of this chapter is a hypothetical case that supposes a typical Israelite. Right? When the Israelites arrive in the land sometime in the future from this passage, God is going to distribute the land. Every family will be given some land with a responsibility to tend to it. But what follows in what we're going to read is this progressive series of misfortunes whereby things don't go so well for a particular landholder. Regulations are given for what to do with the land and with this man. And so look at verse 25. And this is where we're going to jump a little bit, so you have to track with me. Verse 25 opens up by saying, "If your brother becomes poor and sells part of his property, then his nearest redeemer shall come and redeem what his brother has sold." Jump to verse 29. "If a man sells a dwelling house in a walled city, he may redeem it within a year of its sale. For a full year he shall have the right of redemption." Go to verse 35. In between each of these are just details about what we've just read. Verse 35, "If your brother becomes poor and cannot maintain himself with you, you shall support him as though he were a stranger and a sojourner, and he shall live with you." Verse 39, "If your brother becomes poor beside you and sells himself to you, you shall not make him serve as a slave. He shall be with you as a hired worker and as a sojourner." Verse 47, "If a stranger or a sojourner with you becomes rich, and your brother beside him becomes poor, and sells himself to the stranger or sojourner with you, or to a member of the stranger's clan, then after he is sold, he may be redeemed." Okay, so I admit there are a lot of details we just skipped over, and there's some fascinating nuances about each of these circumstances. But what I wanted you to catch was the journey. We started with a man who had been given property by God. But for whatever reason, the man was unable to sustain his property, and so he sold it. If you don't own land, where do you move typically? To a city. And so in verse 29, we find instructions for somebody who's living in a city. But what if your situation gets worse? Where do you go then? What means do you have? To a family member, probably. There your family allows you to live, perhaps even is able to support you and give you some means to work to get back onto your feet. But what if you squander that opportunity and you become indebted to your family? Well, they are to receive you, not as a slave, but as a hired worker. And in this way, you may actually pay off your debt. And what next? What if you haven't gotten any? What if you don't have any family and your family refuses to give you any more chances? Well, the final option detailed is that you become the indentured servant of a foreigner, a resident alien. Couple things to point out from this section. This man is not receiving charity along the way, because whatever support he receives at each descending level is actually in return for some amount of work or property that he sold. In fact, it seems that each level provides the man a reasonable opportunity that should he figure things out, he would be able to purchase himself out of his current level, or at least with some help have that happen. It also needs to be said that this is not anything resembling capitalism as we understand it. There are no predatory lenders here or creditors that work for banks that are trying to make as much money as possible for their investors. There is no interest paid in any of these circumstances, because the intention is that you help a brother out, that you help one among you to be redeemed, to be restored. The purchaser in each of these instances is not taking advantage of a destitute man, but is giving him a fair rate for the return that he expects to get on the property that he's taking over. Looking at the whole, then, where does the journey begin and where does it end? It starts with a man who has his inheritance from God. In his possession is the land that God has given to his fathers. But by the end of the journey, the man has sunk to the lowest possible realm of existence, at least for an Israelite. Proverbs tells us, as a dog returns to his vomit, so a fool repeats their folly. The man has returned all the way to being in the service of a foreigner. The very situation that God had rescued the Israelites from is now this man's lot. Though the foreigner is restrained from treating the Israelite as a slave and is not allowed to be harsh to him, he is nonetheless the Israelite's debtor. But this is by no means a permanent condition. Because at the end of 50 years, the shofar will blow throughout the land and liberty will be proclaimed to all of its inhabitants. And set free from service to foreigners, set free from service to family, the man will be released. This is good news. But he is not merely released from debt with nothing to start over with. He returns to the land that was given to his fathers, God's gracious and generous gift. On the day when all of Israel together is proclaiming their forgiveness of sin by God, so too are they released from the consequences of their sin. We haven't said anything yet about how this man got into such a situation, but we're going to move into the next chapter in order to see how this gets explained. And so we look at chapter 26. Beginning in verse 1, we hear God say, "You shall not make idols for yourselves, jumping to the end of that verse, for I am the Lord your God. You shall keep my Sabbaths and reverence my sanctuary. I am the Lord. If you walk in my statutes and observe my commandments and do them, then I will give you your rains in their season, and the land shall yield its increase, and the trees of the field shall yield their fruit. And it goes on. And we jump to verse 9. I will turn to you, and I will make you fruitful and multiply you, and I will confirm my covenant with you. You shall eat old store, food from previous years, long kept, and you shall clear out the old to make way for the new. You get the sense that this is overflowing with abundance. For the very first time since the Israelites arrived at Mount Sinai, God is explicitly laying out the benefits of keeping God's covenant. It's more than just consequences or punishments if they break the covenant. There is life, and there is life in abundance to be found in walking with God, in seeking him, in drawing near to him, in listening to his voice and doing what he instructs. And what is expanded upon here then is what we heard back in verse 18 of chapter 25. The promise of abundance is tied to the Israelites' faithfulness to the covenant made at Mount Sinai that God offered them and that they readily embraced. Obey God's instructions, worship only him, and it's real simple. Your land is going to experience unprecedented plenty. Which sends us back to our guy, the guy who lost everything. There is only one way to explain how such a person could end up in such a situation. Bound by God's covenant, he was reaping the consequences of his rebellion. You can see that in an Israel marked by faithfulness to God's covenant, in an Israel that's so committed to God and walking faithfully with him that they are filled to overflowing with rain and plentiful crops, there would actually never be a need for something called Jubilee. And so this law is given as grace, as a predictor of Israel's unfaithfulness, as a means by which unfaithful Israelites might be redeemed by their fellow Israelites who had experienced God's redemption themselves and were eager to extend it to their fellow countrymen. The redeemed become redeemers, practicers of redemption. Briefly, this has to be said in talking about this. James in the New Testament probably says it the clearest when he says simply, it rains on the just and the unjust. Possibly the worst way to apply this verse is to fail to recognize that the benefits and consequences that are listed in this chapter are specifically related to a covenant that God made with Israel at Sinai. We are not participants in that covenant. This kind of promise of benefits and consequences does not hold up within the new covenant, the covenant that God has established with us through Jesus. It's important that we understand that. And so we don't take directly the lessons from this passage and carry them on to us, if that makes sense. That our failures are what create poverty in our world. This is no longer the case. So I want to transition to keep reading in verse 14. Because I want us to get a flavor for the way that the consequences work. And I'll be honest, I'm going to skip most of them. I'm going to hit the ones that are particularly relevant to the redemption of the land. But you can go back and read them because they're uncomfortable. And that will be fun for you. Verse 14. But if you will not listen to me, right? Here's the transition. But if you will not listen to me and you will not do all these commands, if you spurn my statutes, and if your soul abhors my rules, so that you will not do all my commandments, but you break my covenant, right? You get the point. They are rebellious. If you rebel against this agreement that we have made together, then I will do this to you. Jump to verse 14. 17. And if, in spite of this, you will not listen to me, then I will discipline you again, sevenfold for your sins, and I will break the pride of your power, and I will make your heavens like iron and your earth like bronze, and your strength shall be spent in vain. For your land, here it is, shall not yield its increase, and the trees of the land shall not yield their fruit. Right here, you find the consequences that would result in someone, this guy we looked at earlier, not being able to sustain their land. But then look at the pattern that follows. We're going to do some jumping again. Verse 21. If you walk contrary to me and will not listen to me. Verse 23. If by this discipline you are not turned to me and walk contrary to me. Verse 27. If in spite of this you will not listen to me but walk contrary to me. You see how that works? Verse 33, I will scatter you among the nations. Did you hear that? They will be made to live among foreign nations. Jump to verse 39. Those of you who are left shall rot away in your enemies' lands because of their iniquity, and also because of the iniquities of their fathers, they shall rot away like them. But if they confess their iniquity and the iniquity of their fathers in their treachery that they committed against me, and also in walking contrary to me, so that I walked contrary to them and brought them into the land of their enemies, if then their uncircumcised heart is humbled and they make amends for their iniquity, then I will remember my covenant with Jacob. I will remember my covenant with Isaac and my covenant with Abraham, and I will remember the land. Without reading all of it, I hope you could catch the movement of this passage. From covenant faithfulness, there is betrayal, and then there are consequences. But in the midst of consequences, there is a word inviting a change of direction. The unfaithful are given a chance to respond with humility, but they don't. And there are greater consequences. But then another word comes, inviting a change of directions, but it too is rejected, and again, until exactly like the man from chapter 25, Israel loses everything and is found living, surviving at the hands of foreigners. Israel, in a tragic irony that rivals anything written by Shakespeare, winds up back where she started. Exiled, distant from God, forsaken. Or is she? Verse 44. Yet for all of that, when they are in the land of their enemies, I will not spurn them, neither will I abhor them, so as to destroy them utterly and break my covenant with them. For I am the Lord, their God. But I will, for their sake, remember the covenant with their forefathers, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt in the sight of the nations, that I might be their God. I am the Lord. These are the statutes and rules and laws that the Lord made between himself and the people of Israel through Moses on Mount Sinai. It shouldn't surprise us that when a guy named Luke writes his gospel, and the sequel to that gospel, the book of Acts, he sees redemption at the very center, the very heart of what God is up to through Jesus. This redemption is not just some spiritual disembodied salvation, but it is a bodily, it is economic, it is political, and it is to make its way to the ends of the earth. But what we remember as the starting place for this gospel redemption is that before we can say anything about God, we have to say this. This God is insanely faithful to the covenant promises that he makes. And we are recipients of that faithfulness. That faithfulness by which God seeks to redeem those things that have been lost or taken. This morning, as we come to the table, we come grateful that God would offer himself for us, to redeem us from lawlessness and to purify for himself a people of his own possession who are zealous to do good works. You should remember that from what Derek read for us earlier. Such that as we walk away from the table today, reminded of our redemption, that we have been redeemed by God, we ought to be eager to extend this redemption through our love, through our lives, to those that we come into contact with. If our servers would come forward.